There are few games that capture the quirkier vibe of the earlier PlayStation years quite as well as Ape Escape. In an era and on a system where games were generally, keyword generally, aiming to sit on that cutting edge of mature content, appealing to that audience of older kids, teens, even adults that had maybe felt like they were aging out of Nintendo and wanted something different from Sega, Ape Escape not only arrived late to the PS1 party, it did so in a completely different costume. Released over a quarter century ago in June 1999, Ape Escape was unabashedly colorful, eccentric, different from most PlayStation games, even its kinda cousins Crash and Spyro that moved towards a sometimes cruder cut of cartoony. On top of its moderate sales performance, Ape Escape picked up an immediate die-hard audience that has essentially waited ever since for another game to be quite the same. See, for many, even Ape Escape's direct sequels didn't scratch the same itch, the sequels that were lucky enough to find their way outside of Japan, that is. The franchise was perhaps the first A-list victim of PlayStation's growing pains, as Sony's European and American publishing arms localized the games independently without communicating with players or seemingly one another, often making it unclear which Ape Escape games would come where, when. In fact, Sony Computer Entertainment Japan independently signed a publishing deal with Ubisoft to bring Ape Escape 2 to North America, bypassing, SCE America. That's to say nothing about the multiple dubs themselves. Ask any English-speaking player what a character's name is in these games, and you'll get a completely different answer based on where they're from, or if they're European, simply which game you're talking about because the game's dubs switched back and forth between the original and localized names. Partly due to Ape Escape 1 being up to that point the only Japanese PlayStation game outside of Gran Turismo that was both made in-house by a Sony team and successful beyond just Japan, as well as due to the inexperience of a team of mostly Sony music employees learning how to make a game without any sort of framework, the Ape Escape franchise after this first game rapidly ballooned into a series of spin-offs and minigame collections that made it even harder to figure out which identity the series should stick to. It took no time at all for this to reach its breaking point either. The second Ape Escape game, intended to capitalize off the PS2's hot launch in Japan, was not Ape Escape 2, but a spin-off that didn't even utilize the unique right-stick control scheme that had made the first title stand out so much. After Ape Escape 2 did eventually release, the franchise followed up with a shotgun blast, 10 distinct Ape Escape games published in 3.5 years, including 4 party games, a racing game, an RPG, a remake, and sandwiched in the middle of all of this, the long-awaited Ape Escape 3. Each new game, gimmick, spin-off, and protagonist contributed to these diminishing returns and this identity crisis that damned the series into irrelevance even in its home region, not a decade after essentially selling the world on the style of controller we still use today. Oh, and I can't forget a Metal Gear minigame in here too, which single-handedly helped our monkeys sneak their way into more households than the series' own modest sales ever did. This is all to say that Ape Escape was always kind of a mess, and I actually do mean that as a compliment. See, the further you pull back into the big picture, the more you can see the franchise as a darling example of an inexperienced division's growing pains, of the fun, weirder era of PlayStation where developers were able to throw more at the wall without risking falling behind. This panoramic view of the series is also an example of the designer's slow realization that less was sticking as more was being thrown, that a linchpin of Japan's studio had become a crutch, a mascot without much of an audience. However, as you zoom back in on those individual snapshots, like with just Ape Escape 1 as we're going to do today, you're immediately pulled into that moment in 1999 when the game wowed a few million players, most of whom sadly never actually bought in the age of demo discs and rentals. This first game's charm captures you so quickly that even if you have no nostalgic memories of Ape Escape, after just a few levels, you're gonna find yourself unconsciously joining the die-hard chance for the series to return. This is an icon that, for most, peaked right at the first title, a unique limbo for an equally unconventional game, a mascot for a melancholic movement. What is it that makes this classic tick a quarter century later? Why did this particular game strike gold and become so iconic that a couple sequels and a dozen more spin-offs rode the slowly fraying coattails before the fabric finally ran out? This is Ape Escape. I think the very first moments of this game instantly sell it to anybody who sees it for even a second, whether it's watching a friend load it on their CRT, or you renting it from Blockbuster, perhaps just anybody passing by in a game shop that had this running on a demo kiosk. Or at least more accurately, the opening sells it to anybody who's remotely cool. The intro montage showing your monkey's supervillain Spectre leading an army of apes out of a theme park, with its punchy cuts to these apes dancing and firing machine guns at the camera, all set to an incredible drum and bass theme that I can only describe as the progenitor of penis music. It's genuinely all fantastic. Everybody make sure you bully the first person in the comments that gets upset that I called it penis music. Even the sourest of souls would agree that at the bare minimum, the first hour of Ape Escape lives up to that amped up intro, again both in 1999 and still today. You've got your nowadays nostalgic warbly city textures in the opening cutscene as our soon-to-be hero Spike and his friend Jake are talking about a time machine being built by the Professor, all of course with the trademark 90s low-budget voice acting from non-union talent who fell off the face of the earth afterwards. And yet these low-budget voices and sound effects somehow harmonize with the exceptional for the time cutscene framing. As Spike and Jake enter the lab, they find Spectre and the monkeys have tied up the Professor and his assistant Natalie and are activating the time machine to go back to the past and build an ape empire. We've got a dynamic door opening transition, some split screen shots of them being pulled into the time station, smooth zooms and pans, and in the following cutscene, a persistent TV static effect over the top of the Professor's long tutorial exposition. It's no Metal Gear Solid, of course, but it's way beyond the sort of shot composition you'd expect from a collectathon platformer at the time. It fittingly transforms the game itself into a time machine. For earlier retrospectives like my Learning to Love Sonic Adventure video, I made an active effort to get into the mindset of a kid picking up that game on launch day with no preconceptions of what it should be, and just getting engrossed in a style of game that was still coming into its own, ignoring today's distractions and separating out the modern critiques of spots where time and genre evolution would highlight some rust. This is generally something I try to do with a lot of games I play because I live alone, and Ape Escape might be the most seamlessly I've ever gotten into that zone. Its charm lowers your guard before coming out swinging, and it commands you to play on its terms. I was an N64 to PS2 kid, so I didn't play this game for more than a few passing moments prior to the classic re-release on PS5 a couple years back, and both times I've played it since then, it's triggered this immense anemoia, making me nostalgic for an experience that I had missed out on. Now, as far as what its terms are, if you've ever played one of the few Ape Escapes that's not a spin-off, you know the series' trademark control scheme, or the non-spin-off series' trademark control scheme. See, Ape Escape was the very first game to require a DualShock controller, and it acted in many ways as a tech demo to show off all of the DualShock's cool new features. The left stick, of course, moves you around, but the right stick doesn't control the camera. No, that's what the D-pad is for. The right stick instead is for using your equipped gadget, whether it's swinging the iconic monkey net or a club to beat and stun the monkeys, pulling the stick back to fire a slingshot, or any of the other gimmicks we'll get into later. In pretty much any two-stick game with a controllable camera in any year after 1999, this should all feel wrong. Just like it may feel wrong that the jump button is a dex, it's R1 or R2. This game is bumper jumper because the face buttons are your gadget quick select, you see. By now, most everybody watching this video is so used to the accepted standards, the language of games, that anything that tries to change the mold usually grosses us out. But even a quarter century later, Ape Escape's intuitive and smooth enough for you to immediately buy in. Chasing monkeys around this tutorial level is really all the calibration you'll need. Well, outside of getting used to a couple quirks like when a monkey stops in his place and turns to try to fight you off, and his hitbox has a bit more range than you might expect and actually outranges your attack weapons, but that's okay though, just eat a cookie to get your health back. Interestingly, the tutorial also cuts you off early, with some excellent mission complete fanfare when you've captured the requisite number of apes, leaving one behind who was just a bit too high up to reach. It sets the expectation that you don't have to catch them all in one go, and that even when you want to, you'll probably have to come back with some new gadgets later on. Speaking of those gadgets, as part of the game's first proper level, you're given training for your first gadget besides the monkey net and the club. Well, okay, it's actually still a net, but this is a different water net that lets you swim and capture apes underwater. Every new gadget you get in Ape Escape has one of these forced tutorials first, and the little time station hub area actually lets you go back in at any time and replay them in case it's been a while and you've maybe forgotten what an item does. This was not a common feature back then, so it is very welcome. The water net auto-equips the moment you start swimming, and also introduces any DualShock newcomers to the L3 and R3 buttons. Clicking the left stick will have Spike dive and descend while underwater, while clicking the right stick is how you fire the net. This isn't super intuitive since there's no ascend button, you just kind of have to let go of the stick entirely and stop moving to trigger Spike to swim up to the surface. It's a little quirky, like I understand why the face buttons aren't used for diving since they want you to have your hand on the right stick, but this is the only time some of the controller integration starts to feel a bit wonky or forced in my opinion. Thankfully, there aren't too many underwater apes out of the 204 total wreaking havoc throughout the game. Or more accurately, the handful that are underwater don't tax the weird controls too much. I'll take them any day over the annoying UFO apes where your slingshot aiming isn't sensitive or fast enough to really keep pace with them. By the way, there's a whole dress code these monkeys use to signal how difficult they're going to be for you to catch. I'll go through that and the level makeups themselves a little later. The 6 main worlds each broadly cover an era in time, kinda. World 1 has a prehistoric theme, 2 has a ruins vibe, and then it jumps to a beach world, which feels a little bit out of place, then the Ice Age, then feudal Japan, and finally, Futurama.
All I want out of life is to be a monkey of moderate intelligence who wears a suit. That's why I've decided to transfer to business school.
No! Every world contains 3 stages, and the amount of monkeys both in the level itself and required to finish that level will vary wildly. Some levels early or even mid-game only have a couple apes because they're tiny, others have dozens. The Jungle Ruins World 2 in order has a descending 14, 13, and 8 monkeys in its 3 stages. But then outside of the gauntlet levels at the end of the final 3 worlds, most levels after this are lucky if they have even 8. The kicker is you won't actually know how many monkeys are in a level or how many you've yet to collect until you've entered a stage because the level select only tells you whether you've 100%ed it or not. Usually you'll expect scope and requirements to progress linearly, or for all the levels in a collectathon to have the same standards, but Ape Escape goes way against that mentality, even down to giving you gadgets just whenever it feels like it. You can really tell that Ape Escape was made by people who were new to making video games, and it's part of what makes it feel fresh compared to those standard game design tenets you're used to, even if it also has these quirky caveats. The game's director, for example, was a sound designer, credited on a dozen PS1 games in just 1999 alone. Ape Escape was the only time in his career that he wasn't working specifically on the sound side. 2 of the 5 game designers essentially only ever worked on Ape Escape 1 and more or less left the industry after. 1 further worked in planning for Ape Escape 2 and 3 before, again, leaving the industry. Same goes for the coders and the artists, although the latter did fare a bit better. The trend still holds that most only ever worked on Ape Escape, some of them only Ape Escape 1 and 2, and then left gaming entirely. Notably, one programmer who did stick around after Ape Escape became the only person to work on all 3 mainline Ape Escapes and Astrobot. And one character artist became the unfortunate soul who had to have his name forever associated as the director of some of Sony's worst received or most memed games of all time, like the PS Move Ape Escape game Kung Fu Rider, and as the game director on both NACs. That last one should let you know that this wasn't Japan Studio laying developers off between games either. People simply bounced around between the actual 100 pet projects within Japan Studio from 1999 through 2013, most of which never saw the light of day, because when you give everybody's idea complete freedom with little to no guardrails and then go focus on other stuff like, oh god, we need PS Vita games we forgot, well, this is what happens. I know I said I was focusing on just the first game, but when have I ever not gone into the weeds on important background context? This discontinuity is part of why each Ape Escape game has such a different feel. Hell, even level to level in this first game, and honestly 2 and 3, things can still feel wildly different. The whiplash that works in the first game's favor is the very same whiplash that sort of cursed the franchise and any part of Japan Studio that wasn't tied down to a specific auteur director. It's what cursed them to wistfully bounce from gimmick to gimmick, from project to project. Ape Escape's level sizes themselves make for some pacing struggles, often giving you a stage that's just one and done in a second before throwing you into one that feels like it goes on forever. That said though, although the gadgets at first feel like they're just sometimes tossed at you randomly, even giving you 2 essentially back to back, in hindsight they end up feeling perfectly interspersed to give you something new every time you start to feel like you need a change. Probably because they were designed that way too, sprinkled in whenever the designers themselves were starting to get a bit bored. The first level in World 2 gives you the iconic monkey radar so that you can point in any direction with the right stick and find out if there's an ape in that direction or just in the part of your stage at all. This timing is perfect to get you used to it before the next stage throws you into a bunch of ruins with several different rooms the game has to load you into separately, a place where it would be really easy to get lost or hung up trying to find that pesky last ape. Some other gadgets include the aforementioned slingshot, housing different types of ammo, including, mercifully, a homing shot to spare you the trouble of getting shots perfect with the pretty finicky aiming. There's a hula hoop introduced at the start of the beach world, which may be the most unique gadget I can recall seeing in an early platformer. You spin the stick in a circle to spin the hoop around Spike, and once you've revved it up, it allows Spike to sprint up ramps or across unstable falling platforms, and kill most enemies along the way that you might run into. After this, there's a pretty long break in new items until you get the Skyflyer, granting you an ascended helicopter jump and glide by continually spinning the right stick, and then an even longer gap until you get the RC car near the game's conclusion. For the record, by the way, the stages and worlds do all have names, but those names vary depending on which localization you're playing, so I'm not even gonna bother. Outside of that RC car gadget being a little wonky due to sometimes having to control it and Spike at the same time with two different sticks, not to mention the camera perspective, outside of that, these gadgets are just absurdly fun to use. Sure, they're definitely the PS1 equivalent of gimmicky motion controls, but where both of those concepts would wow you at first, these don't really get old. Most apes and their placements are designed to allow for you to bonk them with any number of these attacks so that you have the freedom to stick with whichever 4 items you have mapped to the face buttons at any given point, or to let you just stick with one favorite for the sake of extra challenge. As long as you can swap to the net and capture them in time, the game doesn't care. Even then, a ton of monkeys can be caught with just the net alone, whether you choose to sneak up on them by crawling using the L3 and R3 buttons, or run right up to them and start blasting. In general, between the bright, whimsical style, the tech showcasey controls that aren't afraid to redefine basic conventions, the game being unabashedly, unapologetically weird, it may just be the most Nintendo a Sony game had ever been prior to Astro, to the point that the series might have actually had a better chance at long-term success had it been a Nintendo franchise. Or it may have ended up being put on ice like a bunch of Nintendo franchises have been too. Honestly, it's hard to say. It's not like the PS1's whole thing wasn't being the cool, more mature alternative that older kids should get that would make younger kids also want it. Even the PS1's other colorful platformers tended to have a little more edge to them. Like, yeah, sure, this does have monkeys with guns who would sometimes moon you, but so did DK64 the same year. The unique analog controls aren't limited to just these gadgets either. There are, for example, rafting sections where each of your oars is mapped to a stick, which might evoke nightmares of Mario Party minigames. And speaking of, there are 3 multiplayer minigames you can unlock by finding enough of the game's hidden Spectre coins. Trying to pizza and french fry properly while skiing is a lot harder on analog sticks than it looks. At its surface, again, Ape Escape may just seem like a gimmick or a tech demo, but it is so much more than that. Part of why this game's stick configuration works so well is that its development began at the exact perfect time. Sony's Japan studio really only became a proper game development studio at the end of 1996, and even then, it was super loosely organized, with many folks bouncing between projects at their own whims. Again, that's a very freeing trend that would also end up penning the studio's death warrant. Right as what would become the Ape Escape team began putting together a concept sometime between late 1996 and early 1997, at the time for a prototype called Project Kids with a Z, Sony had internally unveiled the DualShock controller. More specifically, the dual analog controller, which, yes, is a different thing. This controller is a super neat oddity, with concave thumbsticks more resembling the PS4 and 5 controllers, as well as 2 distinct analog modes. One which allowed you to simulate the PS1 flight stick's analog mode, the other being the analog mode that any PS1 or 2 player knows very well. It also had a different method of vibration which only worked if handcrafted into specific games rather than globally for some reason. None of this is relevant here, but it's the only time I'll ever have a reason to talk about either of these controllers and tell you that the Spyro games actually have a hard-coded custom control scheme built in when the PS1 detects the flight stick. Somebody at Insomniac just thought that shit would be cool, and it is. With sticks that quickly drifted, the dual analog controller was simply a worse version of the DualShock, which replaced it 7 months later. Both the dual analog and the DualShock were in planning and production simultaneously. Again, this company was Japan's biggest, most bloated tech firm, leaping into developing games and gaming hardware with absolutely no direction at all. They just made it up as they went along for the first 15 years. And that's why Ape Escape's pre-production phase was such a perfect fit for this moment in time in 1997. Most other games were too far along to utilize the analog stick as a core feature beyond maybe camera mapping, and given that Sony was showing off two competing dual analog controllers to third-party developers at the same time, which certainly couldn't inspire confidence, nobody else was willing to lock their game out from the 30-ish million PS1 owners already out there at the time, who would then have to spend about $40 each on their game and a now required controller. For anybody keeping score, that means the DualShock cost as much to a 1998 buyer as an $80 controller does today. But this new Project Kids/Ape Escape game wasn't just a first-party title that could act as a loss leader, its timing also synced perfectly with the DualShock. Even if Ape Escape had the fastest production cycle of any 3D platformer made up to this point in time, it would still be at the earliest 18 full months off, giving the DualShock ample time to start working its way into some homes organically. It didn't have the fastest production of any 3D platformer either. That 1.5 years ended up being closer to 2.5, given the team mostly being brought over from Sony Music and learning how to make games. Even before the PlayStation, Sony's limited gaming inroads were managed mostly by Sony Japan's music division. Games were treated sort of like albums, bringing in outside talent solely for that one project and having an in-house Sony employee act as the producer for that project. This was also how the PlayStation ecosystem worked in the US and Europe early on as well, to be clear. Many of the PS1 and 2 era's big-name directors, your David Jaffe types of the world, just happened to be Sony's only employed game testers in the early 90s, so they were the ones that were asked to step up and direct things. The difference was that in America and Europe, Sony's regional offices began to absorb those third-party studios into the company proper and also started building out a larger in-house production team. Partly because every console still had exclusive licensed sports games at the time, because sports games were easy sellers in the US in particular, and often acted as the cutting-edge showcases of why your hardware was cooler than the other guys. PlayStation's Japanese arm, though, for much of its existence, struggled to do either of those things. That is, build out in-house teams or absorb smaller third-party teams that couldn't quite stand on their own. Just about the lone exception was one small team making racing games. You've probably never heard of them. When longtime Sony employee Shuhei Yoshida took the reins at Japan Studio in '96, having worked as the PlayStation's third-party licensing lead and being the Japanese English facilitator when bringing Crash Bandicoot to Japan, he was the one to start establishing internal, clearly defined development teams for projects like Ape Escape, Ico, or The Legend of Dragoon. However, they were still never really all that defined, as people floated around between projects like you often hear at Nintendo or any multi-team company. This is also why if you hear people asking to bring back, say, Parappa or Hot Shots Golf, I wrote this well before Hot Shots Golf came back, that's not exactly easy to do when the studio and people actually responsible for developing Parappa or Hot Shots Golf never actually worked at Sony. Outside of Ape Escape, Team Ico's work, and the Siren/Gravity Rush team, Japan Studio still ended up mostly being a co-publisher offering development assistance or localization from this point in 1996 up through about 2010. Around that time, there was a second attempt to restructure Japan Studio during the PS3 era to attempt to optimize things and stop having genuinely dozens of unfinished, impossible-to-release pet projects that people had been working on for years in their own little corner. That part of Japan Studio is a story for another day. If you've played Ape Escape before, you're starting to see why it is the way that it is, with weird controls, inconsistent level sizes that bounce all over the place, and above all else, a whimsical design philosophy and creative vibe that brings it all together. It's a vibe that few, if any, other games really capture, because outside of select indies, most games tend to be made by game people, who have more fully bought into that language of game design. There are these sorts of layers of matted fur that you have to shave away to get to the core of Ape Escape, since usually all you hear is the "it's so good" or "nostalgic, man, why don't they make it anymore" stuff. And since few folks have ever really dug into what Japan Studio or the Ape Escape sub-teams actually were and weren't, it's far easier to wax nostalgic about the idea of a game or studio versus truly recognizing that behind that developer logo are a team of humans who come and go as their careers develop. I'm sure Team Asobi isn't thrilled that after making the best-selling game not named Gran Turismo to ever come out of PlayStation Japan, a decent chunk of comments about them online are still, well, it's the same guys who did Ape Escape, they could totally do another, when most of the people that worked on that game are younger than you. 40 of the 70 people that worked there on Astrobot either started their career with one of Astro's games, or if not, they started on Knack. There's a reason Nintendo doesn't usually specify which teams are working on their games anymore, because we like to attribute credit and blame to past works when what we call teams don't really exist for more than a couple projects. And this is the reason that Ape Escape was such an incredible time capsule, because it was made by this ephemeral sub-team that organically split apart years before any of us even noticed. So the very same thing that made this game's coat shine so much, this throw stuff at the wall mentality by inexperienced folks from outside the games industry, was what led to that hair eventually matting over time, as it was the only globally successful series made in-house there that could reliably keep pumping out fast sequels or spin-offs. On one end, as they learned more, it would continue to be more difficult for them to think of unique, anti-gamey things to throw at the wall that would actually work, not to mention a frequently rotating staff meant that the vision kept changing and there was nobody there to brush out the knots. Not really sure where that metaphor went, but now would have been a great time for a Razer ad. There's not one. But if you want the cutting edge of Golden Bolt content before anybody else, consider throwing money at me on Patreon or with the join button. Sorry, I couldn't let that go to waste. To reiterate, all of this chaotic backstory is what worked in Ape Escape 1's favor, as the unorthodox staff makeup and having just started planning the game meant that they looked at the DualShock controller as an opportunity, a playground of its own. The 30 months of development meant that by the time the game would even come out, about twice as many PS1s had entered the wild, on the cusp of becoming, at the time, the highest selling home console ever, and the DualShock would have had both the 1997 and 1998 holiday seasons to sneak into console bundles and not bottleneck the game's upside. And on top of all this, with Crash 3 having released in 1998, there was now a huge hole to fill in the PS1 platformer scene. Ape Escape only had to compete with, oddly enough, 3 Reptiles, plus another monkey game on N64. Spyro and DK obviously won out, but even at a distant third, Ape Escape was an instant hit in its own right, quickly crossing the million sales mark. Now, it's hard to say where its true total sales would have ended up, since European sales for a ton of games in this era were just never properly reported, but the PS1 discs safely ended up in the 1.5 to 2 million sales range, accounting for likely at least a third of the series' lifetime performance, more likely closer to half. It might even be 60%. Mind you, this was a very different era of video game sales. Only 100 or so PS1 games even crossed the million mark, and each region had its own unique flavor of games that often didn't connect with the other two. Hot Shots Golf or Parappa, for example, quintessential PlayStation games for those who owned them or have ever looked at a PS1 and its games library, they didn't actually do that well at retail outside of Japan. More people in the US probably know Parappa from demo discs or just general gaming zeitgeist than actually bought the game. Hot Shots Golf did find a footing in the US with the PS2 games several years later, and fun fact, in Japan the first game was the 7th best-selling PS1 release ever there, ahead of Resident Evil, which is insane. Likewise, Twisted Metal and Wipeout were locally developed US and UK games respectively, which became defining launch titles and franchises in their regions that didn't make nearly the same impact anywhere else. Ape Escape 1 being able to mirror its success across all 3 regions put it up there with really only Crash and Gran Turismo as far as the Sony-funded lineups went. Obviously, it was at a far lower tier than either of those 2 games, and Crash is of course a messy story given that Sony only funded marketing, publishing, and localization, but technically not development itself. That's neither here nor there. Along with Ape Escape's success came critical acclaim because the innovative controls, the whimsical style, and the creative challenges clicked enough for some contemporary reviewers to label it the single best platformer on the PlayStation 1. Ape Escape was a perfect storm in 1999. Right place, right time, right weather. Even a quarter century later, many of my, and I'm assuming other retrospective critics' complaints are either simple preferences or moments where the designer's imaginative vision feels like it exceeds what the gameplay and the controller were consistently capable of. Broadly, the kind of flaws that every game has. Even then, many of these are countered by places where that PS1 era jank ends up compounding the game's charm, like the trademark 90s bad voice acting. Some of those nitpicks I have are in the same vein as some of the smaller stuff I mentioned earlier that does add up. For one, not being able to tell on the stage select screen the specific amount of collectibles that you haven't yet obtained until you've already loaded into that level. It simply tells you whether you've cleared it or when you've gotten to 100%. Not ideal when we're talking about a possibly scratched CD that could take a while to load you in and then back out if you find out that you did in fact get all the Spectre coins. See, first you load into a little in-game scene where this AI assistant shows you the level requirements before then loading again to get you into the stage proper. It's all missing that final pass of UI polish, that quality of life pop to take it over the top, and this is doubly true since the game doesn't really make a huge effort to highlight when you've finished one world and moved on to the next. Let's say you finished up all 3 stages in one world. You usually get an expository cutscene where the professor spends maybe 40 seconds telling you that you're about to enter the Ice Age or whatever, but those really start to blend together when half the time there are 2 or 3 such cutscenes in a row, since the first few worlds also start with a separate but visually identically framed scene where the professor explains via Zoom call the new gadget you just found. Otherwise, the level select screen only swaps the top text to reflect the new world name as you cycle through. No animation, a less satisfying sense of progression. I should also say, you don't actually find the gadgets, like they're not just sitting in set levels as a reward or anything. There's not even a cutscene of you grabbing one while floating through the time ether. You just suddenly have it because the professor tells you that you found it off screen while floating through time. Again, minor things, but it stuck out to me the first time I played given the game's general polish otherwise. Even reusing the one wormhole transition and having the professor chime in over top saying that you found the slingshot would have been a low investment fix compared to all the Zoom calls. I mean, I didn't even realize the first time I played that Worlds 1 and 2 weren't just extensions of the same thing. They're both filled with overgrown, prehistoric stages that mostly go by so quickly that they struggle to leave an impact. In my recordings here, the first world took not even 5 minutes per stage to finish, which, I mean, yeah, you can see why I'd lump World 2 in. Now, it's a common Japanese game design ethos, both now and especially a quarter century ago, to lay thick on the tutorials, to clearly outline the rules for players and avoid any ambiguity or uncertainty. This differs from the organic discovery often expressed in Western games, a simple cultural difference that reflects the respective audiences, neither is right or wrong. It's no surprise that first-time designers would lather that bad boy even further out of caution, but even understanding this, Ape Escape 1 reaches chatty coworker levels of talking at you between the cutscenes and the mandatory gadget tutorials that are filled with text-heavy signposts that force you to read them if you get too close, or just some of those same signposts sprinkled in regular stages, that it actually starts to affect the pace a bit. It's a shame because there are some really charming back and forths between the professor and his assistant written on a lot of these optional ones that you might be liable to skip just so that you can stay in the game's wonderful flow for more than 5 minutes at a time. The example that comes to mind first is that some of the optional signs will mention that different apes have different stats in a way, based on the color of their pants. As you know, the apes aren't just power stars. They're not going to be a cakewalk to grab and move on. Some are faster than others, some are more perceptive, making it harder for you to sneak up, some carry missile launchers. Bit of an escalation there. So for example, the iconic yellow pants monkeys are the standard ones, although because no two apes are 100% alike, some have weapons or are craftier than their fashion alone might lead you to believe. The light blue pants are scaredy cats, or maybe depressed. They don't usually run away, they don't seem to notice you're there unless you're right up on them, and they're slower if they do run. But they're usually sitting around in some crafty hiding spots so that they're not just seen as the easy mode apes. The ones in cutoff jorts, don't you dare tell me these aren't cutoff jorts, let me have this, are fast and throw down obstacles like banana peels to trip you up. Red pants will usually have strong weapons and high attack stats, and if you see a monkey wearing black pants and sunglasses, they already saw you a minute ago from a mile away, and they shoot to kill. One of the neatest things about Ape Escape is that every single monkey you catch has a custom entry in a Monkipedia, no relation to the hit Tony Shalhoub Show's fan wiki, showing their names, stats, and a little personality blurb. Honestly, I could probably make a whole little video just talking about some of these names and descriptions between the US and PAL localizations and the PSP remake. There are just a ton of references throughout. The Monkipedia highlights again that at any point where the game does start to lack, the charm finds a way to bring you back home. Plus, the plethora of gadgets and options makes for such a fun experience where no two players will tackle each ape in quite the same manner. Even early on, you can always choose to catch monkeys by surprise or just run right at them to try and catch them without even concussing them first. As quickly as that tutorial world may go by, there are still some creative and iconic setups like apes hiding in pterodactyl eggshells or a T-Rex mini-boss. It's the kind of stuff that as a kid you would blow up in your mind into these larger-than-life moments. These are stages I'd love a lot more out of, that said, instead of this really inspired dinosaur mountain being 40 steps wide and being done before you know it. Even later in the game, you run into this issue where cool level themes and ideas barely even get touched on because the stages themselves may only run for 5 minutes. World 4, the beach world, opens up with a requirement of catching 5 apes on its first level. There are 4 relaxing on the beach right in front of you, meaning that you're almost finished in, no joke, about 30 seconds. Moreover, catching 3 unlocks this new monkey catch gate to another part of the level, and right on the other side are 2 more apes just sitting on a ledge next to each other. Unless you somehow walked past one of the 4 in plain sight at the start, you're gonna be kicked out of the level after getting one of these 2, even though you could have easily grabbed the other one right afterwards if the game had given you an option to stay. The second beach level isn't much longer, a shame because it has so many visual set pieces like a submarine, a cool waterfall, some vine jumps, and a monkey riding on a shark's back that poses a fun challenge. If you asked me how long that level was without looking, I would have said like 15 to 20 minutes because there are so many landmark moments it plows through. It actually took me 6, playing it for only the second time ever and the first time in years. Those 6 minutes count 30 seconds where I stopped to take notes, and a minute more where I simply goofed up the vine jumps because they don't really play super nicely with the camera. It isn't like there's a mountain of stuff left to do that adds to that 6 minutes on revisit either. There are only 3 extra monkeys here for a total of 8. Most of your time there would be backtracking. Even World 4's final level, which mostly takes place inside a giant dinosaur named Dexter, no relation, I thought it was way longer than the 9 minutes it lasted because there are so many rooms and so much ground to cover. To take it back to charm, shout out to that Dexter level though. Its total lack of music when you first enter until you actually open Dexter's mouth and jump in, that sort of thing just really hits. You can always connect with the love put into each stage on a personal level. You can so clearly feel that every one of these is almost entirely put together by no more than maybe 2 people, just making something that they felt would be cool. But you can also feel the constraints of these creatives cramming in so many ideas into such a short runtime because each designer maybe only got to take point on a couple stages. It's overdressing a plate of food before cooking the meal and ending up with a beautifully dressed half portion. Delicious, but ultimately a little unfulfilling. Similarly, the Ice Age in World 5 introduces ice-cold water that damages on contact, only for that to be used for just the first stage as a one-off platforming hazard to try and make it last more than a few minutes. The other 2 ice stages let or outright require you to swim, and surprisingly, given the heavy tutorialization, that isn't really clear at first. In fairness though, the third level of these is technically longer than the ones I've laid out so far, taking me about 20 minutes to catch enough apes. That's first because I was taking my time and really enjoying the ambient music and cozy vibe, and then because I was stubborn and wanted to conquer the finicky falling platform ice bridge that you've got to hula hoop dash across while avoiding obstacles and hoping that you were aiming exactly straight when you started since there's no room for error or last second correction. That one took me like half of that 20 minutes by itself. I could have just run over to get any other ape in the level, but you can't stop me from hooping. What follows World 5 is yet more pacing whiplash. See, I haven't even mentioned yet that Worlds 3 and 6 are single-level obstacle courses that last 60 seconds as you race Spike's mind-controlled friend Jake from the intro. These are treated like boss encounters and kind of hyped up, but they don't really work. I spent more time playing Noodle Arms boxing than racing Jake. Mario Party minigames can last longer than these. It's all about balance, and Ape Escape's biggest hurdle both as a game here and as a franchise has day one been in maintaining that balance. To be fair, it does kind of work in its favor at times. There's a satisfying kick to just blowing through a level when you can clearly see that there is more off in the distance, the game almost daring you to go right back in and explore. And that's where Ape Escape nails the balance in promising you a horizon of possibilities rather than the nadir of the game's reality when you revisit and realize that there are only maybe a couple apes left to catch that most of the time don't actually require a gadget that you haven't yet obtained. To that end, and talking about this balance, this game has incredible bookends despite sagging a bit in that middle part. Putting aside the tutorial world, which still does set a great tone, and the kinda weak true final boss, putting those aside, worlds 2, 7, 8, and the final level before the true final boss are mostly full of bangers. 7 and 8, Medieval Mayhem and Futurama respectively, take on a decidedly more linear focus and branch out in visual theming from stage to stage instead of following one single motif, and I think that works greatly to the game's benefit. The more open-ended levels prior could vary wildly between tiny dioramas like that dinosaur one and wider, more imaginative affairs that still flew by too quickly due to apes just sitting around together. And similarly, the forest or beach or ice motifs could start to blend together when playing 3 of them in a row due to how short they were. Here in Worlds 7 and 8 though, the levels get a chance to sprawl out a bit more across multiple visually distinct rooms, loading zones, or levels, and it allows for more apes to sit at the end of a proper platforming challenge or puzzle instead of just being out in the open somewhere. Bouncing from city streets to a sewer to Spectre's automated factory producing ever more of the peak point helmets that first granted his superintelligence, to a TV station, these all add a lot more flavor right at the exact point where the game needs to be the most memorable, to give you that final satisfying taste in your mouth that leaves you wanting more. There are still some areas where the monkeys are bunched, the temple level especially, but they'll often take different tactics to catch here and split up more deliberately than they did in the past. These stages often house hidden one-off mini-bosses that you'll have to take down just to catch one last monkey, or a new dual-stick gimmick like a tank where each stick controls one of the treads. The platforming challenges start to challenge a bit more at last, as Spike has to sprint across a giant defensive wall. Some of these get big enough that the draw distance starts to betray you even. Usually not a great thing, but here there's something kind of freeing about having so much ahead of you that the game can't even show it all. That alongside, pardon the pun, a spike in the required number of apes compared to the total in the level means that you get a better sense of challenge and reward, since there are fewer that you can willingly or unknowingly skip past. Even the levels that do keep the more open stage approach end up goading you into completing these more stringent requirements, making completion feel a bit more satisfying. The Medieval World's final level fakeout challenges you to catch Spectre himself, which first requires you to work your way through a series of castle dungeons, catching almost every one of the stage's 20 monkeys along the way. This level then ends with Spectre escaping and flipping this mechanic on you, sending some of his minions to catch and kidnap your friends. Some fun little attention to detail is that until you rescue them by the end of the game, they won't appear in the stage complete screen anymore. I happened to do most of my cleanup of the prior levels right around this point before noticing and realizing that I had had Spike leave them hanging for so long. The final world later on, World 9, is more of a single stage, a massive final gauntlet that's a completely rebuilt version of the theme park that Spectre once lived in prior to stealing the helmet that had given him his newfound superintelligence. And although it has several distinct attractions for you to tackle, you need to catch all 24 monkeys in the stage in order to get to the boss. It feels weird at first that ostensibly the final level is you riding a surprisingly fast roller coaster version of Donkey Kong's minikart levels to save Natalie, and then bouncing over to fighting a drag racing go-kart to break Spectre's mind control over your friend Jake, or fighting in the Wild West attraction, actually just because there's nobody to save in that one. But while it's weird at first, it all kinda clicks. The variety kinda reminds you what made Ape Escape so fun and unique to begin with when you first started the journey. The back half of this behemoth of a level hits on the other part of Ape Escape's charm too, those incredibly fun, linear platforming focus stages we just talked about. Spectre's castle lifts and hovers out of the ground like every good castle should, and it's a straight up half hour of a climb to get to the boss fight at the top. Spectre's giant robot head that acts as the pseudo-final boss is honestly a bit less fun to fight than the first fake-out boss earlier, though both require you to do similar things, such as juggle multiple gadgets, hover over gaps to attack, shoot your slingshot at certain parts of their hulls, etc. This one does have at least one thing going for it though. The first phase has an attack that takes place in second-person point of view, and I always have to point that out because that shit's always cool. Because Spectre escapes once again here, who would have thought it would be so hard to catch a monkey? The true ending takes place in its own separate level once you've caught all 204 apes prior. To help you along the way is a bonus gadget, a spring-loaded boxing glove that punches through walls or strong crates. The completion cleanup I mentioned earlier actually complements the theme park final level that we just finished in reminding you all the bits that make Ape Escape so special. As occasionally unfulfilling as it may be to run through levels for the first time in just a few minutes, there's an inverse and immense satisfaction to cleaning up the last remaining apes in every stage and simply plowing back through all of those levels you just played, only now in even more rapid succession. Even if some stages may only take a couple more minutes to finish, that renewed focus on your surroundings, finding what you missed, not to mention the unique rooms, obstacles, or puzzles that you hadn't yet engaged with, these can help even the smallest diorama levels make you smile again. In short, what made progress feel a bit arbitrary or unearned at points during regular play is the same thing that makes this game a dream for completionists, leaving you with that satisfying last bite and helping you to forget any of the little quirks or critiques that you may have had in the middle. It's like a video game Hot Pocket, maybe a little undercooked in the center, but those ends, they hit different. The true final boss fight, finally against Spectre himself, is almost a little understated. It feels a bit underwhelming at first even. He's still got some powerful AoE attacks, but most of it is shooting slingshot bombs at his floating throne and then hitting him a bunch until his shield breaks. But as you're hitting his shield, you kinda realize what they're going for. In a way, there's not really a more fitting true ending to this game than just going after one final ape in the same exact way you had done the whole time, with a fun chase. After this second credits roll, we see the kids run off to get back to their usual life of playing hopscotch or smoking cigarettes, whatever kids did in 1999, as a back-to-normal, unhelmeted Spectre cradles in the arms of his zookeeper. A little bit melancholy, if you think about it, that the easiest way for him to be happy was to go back to being less intelligent, by force mind you, ignorance is bliss and all that. The game, or at least its localizations, don't ever do all that much to explain that the helmet is injecting evil thoughts into Spectre either, or warping his perspective and making him think the zoo was abusing him and making him want to take revenge. As seen at the end, when he quietly asks about how his handler was doing, he still has some fond or conflicted memories.
How was the man that raised me?
What? You mean the trainer at the amusement park?
So if you really think about Ape Escape's journey a bit more deeply, as told in the dubs at least, Spectre woke up to his captivity and immediately began producing more helmets to allow his brethren intelligence and allow them to break free as well. He didn't keep sentience for himself, he democratized it. Kinda messed up that the professor never even considers making a fixed version that, gets rid of the evil thoughts. Makes you think. Like with the entire game, there's something kinda wonderful under the surface with this ending and story as a whole, just waiting to be polished. On the other hand, that very polish, changing the cheesy voice acting or the completely played straight Saturday morning cartoon vibe, would change the essence of what makes this particular game so special. That's what brings along this next part. Now comes the downer bit. After Ape Escape, despite success critically and commercially, the series began to just crumble. Many of the folks behind one either left or got absorbed in different projects. The next Ape Escape was a Japan-only spin-off that dropped the dual analog gameplay in favor of using a vacuum to suck the dirty ape's pants off to wash them. Perhaps because, by this point, dual analog controllers were now the standard, and Ape Escape's defining tech demo feature was novel no more. Due to that game, the bulk of 2's production unfortunately occurred right as the industry outside Japan shifted completely thanks to GTA and Halo. Generally, when some art we like dies or goes wrong, we look for a reason. It makes us want to point fingers. Even knowing better, I look at what happened after Ape Escape 1 and want to throw blame at some shadowy suit. But truthfully here, it's a situation where no person's really at fault. It takes so many variables working out to even release a bad game, let alone a good one, even more so, a successful one. Like, I suppose you could blame the person leading Japan Studio from 2000 through 2008 for letting this decentralized, free-form development ecosystem at the studio run wild for far too long, leading to the studio falling behind the tech curve, continuing to do its own thing, and overall developing increasingly insular projects. But there wasn't an overall leader within Japan Studio during that 8-year span. That was the problem. Like I said, no person's at fault. The lack of that sort of leadership was the fault. When your production ecosystem sounds eerily similar to Valve, people can just move their desks and switch projects on a whim, it's no wonder you end up with conflicting projects, finished released ideas that get dropped faster than they took to make, or a highly anticipated trilogy conclusion that takes forever to come out. We ended up with a dozen Ape Escapes of wildly different varieties and quality simply because, well, that series worked, let's keep doing that. All as interest at home waned, as interest abroad cratered, and as the US and European markets were becoming increasingly vital, outpacing Japan 2-1 in console sales. Obviously, some of Japan's studios' in-house games would still find success despite this, usually the ones led by firm auteur directors with a proper, standard team hierarchy. Even Ape Escape 2 did do almost as well as 1 in Japan upon its 2002 launch. But due to the unfortunate timing, it was already too late for it to make an impact elsewhere. Sony's American branch already had a number of its own fuzzy platformers slated for 2002 and 3. They just didn't see space in the lineup for an incredibly bright and quirky one without risking sending it to die. Keep in mind as well, this was a franchise immediately and often compared to Nintendo's work right at the same time that Nintendo was visibly on a worrying downturn. Worse still, the fuzziest of those American platformers ended up outselling even the biggest Ape Escape in Japan within just its first year too. SCE Japan went around those American producers and enlisted Ubisoft to localize Ape Escape 2 for summer 2003, while SCE Europe separately localized it for that spring. By then, and even if it had come out at the same time as Japan, it didn't matter how fun Ape Escape 2 was. It simply wasn't a fit for either market's shifting palettes, and it didn't find success in either region. After that point, much of Japan's studio's output began to shift to the coming PlayStation Portable, where smaller projects being made in a corner by just a couple people were far more digestible. One of the first such projects was a full remake of Ape Escape 1. I do gotta say, there's something funny about remaking the first game that showed the magic of having 2 sticks on a system that only has 1. I did also 100% that game, Ape Escape on the Loose, for this video, which might be a surprise since it's taken me just about this long to mention it. That's because it's a fine but generally weaker way to play 1. No right stick means that your face buttons now simply swing that equipped gadget now, which is far less precise. No L3 and R3 means that crawling was moved to R, which means that your jump was moved to X, which means you only have 3 gadgets out at a time now as well. Since your net swing feels shorter, weaker, and less precise, catching monkeys often feels like it requires you to have the club out at all times too, instead of being able to just swing at them. So really a lot of the time, you only have 1 free gadget button to swap. If you've ever played the original versions of Link's Awakening, you know the pain. The camera feels a bit worse too, it all feels a bit worse. Though the new and updated minigames are fun, and D. Bradley Baker as Spectre takes on a much more menacing vibe, which is welcome to be fair. The cheesy PS1 voice acting can't be beat though, so even that is kind of a trade-off. If you only had a PSP, it's fine enough, and it definitely looks great, but thanks to those controls, it ends up more emblematic of the series' identity issues after 1, unable to emulate that first game's magnetism, its knack at just connecting instantly with a wide range of players. I don't believe you can successfully separate Ape Escape from its control scheme, and I also don't believe that those controls can do much as you iterate in future games to fight the inevitability that to many players, they'll start to feel more like a gimmick, and an outdated one to some of those folks too. The main trilogy was still wonderful to play despite the storm going on outside. Hell, I once had to play the entirety of Ape Escape 3 in Japanese solely to record a clip of the Ratchet & Clank ape cameo in essentially the final level, since there was no high-quality video of that ape online, and even without understanding any of the dialogue or text, I had such a blast. But 2 and 3 also struggle to do much truly new that you feel like you haven't seen already in 1. They're both attempts to turn 1's style into a more modern platformer of the era, a tricky endeavor for PlayStation 2 games that are also trying to convince players to stick a generation in the past with a stick scheme designed to sell PS1 controllers. Varying levels of success there. I think that 3's actually the best one from a game design standpoint. However, once you take the non-game designers that made Ape Escape 1 out of the equation and you have those people learning more, and/or you have people with more knowledge helping make these games, that means you can't replicate the singular experience that is Ape Escape 1, a collection of level design philosophies that are all over the place, held together by some tape. It's these two sides of the Spectre coin that I think led to Ape Escape taking off as well as it did, struggling not long after and cratering even sooner after that, while leaving us all feeling like there was some potential that was stolen from us. The freedom, inexperience, and lack of direction at Japan Studio informed one's immaculate vibe, but as that lack of direction continued, the water quickly got muddied, and the folks who worked on 2 were by and large not the same people working on 1, but were folks that understood better how to make a video game, which inherently kinda makes it not Ape Escape, but a tribute album. With all of that in mind, I look at this downer segment here warmly. I don't know what a modern Ape Escape could even look like outside of the immediate appeal of feeling the cute control scheme one more time. Even then, it would be hard to sustain that feeling across a whole game again for many players. We're not as tolerant of quirky controls in a new game compared to accepting it in older ones, and there are tons of players that will buy and play a game for nostalgia but only play the opening level and then never go back because they've already had their fill. I'm certain that a new group of young designers would find ways to introduce fun new gadgets and ideas, and you would definitely see some gyro stuff too in the modern day. Unless you throw a bunch of inexperienced non-designers into the fire, however, as if throwing a bunch of monkeys into a room with a typewriter, you can't really end up with the Shakespeare that is, in this dumb allegory, Ape Escape. A new Ape Escape made by an actual studio, as such, would be more a revival of Ape Escape's sequels and not one. The reason I say that this makes me feel oddly warm is because it means that the game that we're talking about, that first Ape Escape, is a one-of-its-kind moment that we all get to experience, regardless of if we're playing it for the first time in 1999 or 2099. This game, on this system, in this era, it felt right, even when you're emulating it on your PS4 or PS5 or your Steam Deck or whatever. The sequels didn't feel wrong, at least not the main ones, but bottled moments taste different than ones from the tap. So I'm appreciative that we got a game that still feels this immediately enjoyable, this unique, in many ways, this timeless. Even if the trade-off is that not even its sequels can scratch exactly that same itch. It's no coincidence this happened with multiple fledgling PS1 series either. Something in the water. This first Ape Escape is more accessible than ever, so keep convincing your friends to try it out. Keep rallying more people to the cause. Maybe send Namco an email. If you take anything from all this though, do it from a place of optimism instead of the cynicism that we tend to default to. We're fortunate to have had a game whose shortcomings are drowned out by charm factor alone, a game that drives new players this passionately and this instantly into wanting more even all this time later, that right away you can boot it up and go, yep, I get it completely. Nothing, not even a new game, will replicate exactly that, but in spreading the word that way, you get to gush even more about all the ways that Ape Escape is special to you. You might end up realizing even more ways. That's the stuff that gets people to buy into your recommendations. You know what gets results that last beyond a sales spreadsheet? Personality, heart, passion. The same things that made us fall in love with Ape Escape in the first place. Until next time. Stay golden. A massive thanks to all my wonderful supporters for making these videos possible. If you want early or ad-free videos, bonus content, access to the Golden Cult Discord server, and much more, check out the Patreon or hit join here on YouTube. A special shout out to the special golden folks who go above and beyond, like Alexander Sherbula, Koiti Allen, Jumprock, Mason Hunt, Goldstorm07, Tabriz Sadiq, The Critic of Innocence, and Thomas Kuzma. Thank you.